So truth is the object of the intellect. The intellect is the power by which we understand things. So another word for the intellect would be the mind. Okay? And it would not be the brain, though. There's such a thing as the mind-brain problem. What's the relationship between the brain and the mind? They're not synonymous. Okay, so intellect, just think intellect is the power to think. All right? That we all have. And that's what sets us apart from the other animals. We have the power to reason abstractly, like in syllogisms, right? Like we talked about in logical foundations. So, the truth is the object of the intellect. What does that mean? It means what our intellect desires, what it seeks. Okay? So, as intellectual beings, we naturally and necessarily intuit the truth of certain self-evident propositions. So what does that mean? Intuit is like intuition. Think of intuition, which is just like experiencing things. You just experience the truth of certain things. For example, the self-evident proposition of the principle of contradiction. Something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way. That's the principle of contradiction. When you hear that, you're like, duh. Duh. So that's what a self-evident proposition is. When you hear it, you're like, duh. You don't need to explain that to me, silly Willy. So, we have certain self-evident propositions, okay, that we just know are true, okay? Like something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way, all right? They're first principles. Every science has its own first principles. It has certain truths, fundamental truths that are intuited at the beginning. They can't be proven. They're just known. They're just obvious. You start with those and then you move on to prove other things. All right. So, but not all self-evident propositions are intuited. There might be things that are true that we don't just experience the truth of. Okay? And not all that is intuited is self-evident. In other words, we have, on the one hand, certain principles, like the principle of contradiction, this is obvious, but it's a rational principle. It's an abstract thing. Right? It's a rule of reason. It's just there. And on the other hand, we have things that we experience that are just like what we, like I exist. I exist and I'm talking to you right now. Okay, like sense data, basic stuff like that. That we intuit. We experience the truth of our own existence, the fact that we're interacting right now in one way or another, right? Okay, but those aren't self-evident. They're not necessarily true. I could not be walking around talking to you. I could not exist, okay? It's not a necessity. Whereas the principle of contradiction is a necessity. So in philosophy, they call those, on one hand, there's analytic principles, on the other, synthetic, which is like the stuff of human common experience. All right, so we saw in the ontological foundations, we took the principle of contradiction and we deduced, right, necessary syllogism, deduced other principles that are a little less self-evident, but still self-evident, like the principle of causality, the principle of change, principle of finality, principle of sufficient reason. And then we applied those to our common experience of motion, of cause and effect, of contingency, which is another word for dependence, okay, or non-necessity, of gradations in goodness or perfection, and of the directedness of our actions, the fact that actions have goals. We apply those principles to these things of experience, okay, and we come up with the arguments for the proofs, the demonstrations of God's existence, the necessity of a necessary being. Okay, well, in morality and ethics, there are certain primordial truths as well that we intuit. They're first principles. They're just obvious. They're just known right there. Wow. Okay, whether they're analytic or synthetic, doesn't matter. For example, the human being experiences the existence of fundamental goods, different kinds of goods. Okay, so that's our starting point in ethics. there is such a thing as good. Okay, now what do you mean when you say something is good? That's another question. We'll get into that later. Different kinds of goods would kind of go to answering that question. What do you mean when you say something is good? Well, I could be saying that it's useful for me. It's good that it's in that it's useful. Or I could be saying that it's pleasant, or gives pleasure. In one way or another, it doesn't have to be bodily pleasure, which is what we all think of when we hear that word. Although that's good too, in itself. Or the honest good, which is a good that's good in itself. Like justice, or beauty, or love, or friendship. Okay? All those things are just good in themselves. They're not useful, they're not necessarily pleasant. Okay? And they may be sometimes. Alright, so the good fundamentally is the object of the will. So we have intellect and will. Will seeks the good. In fact, that's one way of defining the good. What is desirable or desired. Okay. So we have these different things that are desired or desirable in different ways. Right? Now, so we have intellect and will. As human beings, it set us apart from animals. We'll get back to that in a minute when we talk about anthropological foundations. Now, what is truth? Truth, if you have a realist understanding of reality, remember we talked about realism versus idealism and all that stuff? So, there are various ways of defining truth in the history of philosophy. This, I dare say, is the correct way, but I will not talk about why I think that or what the arguments are. But in other words, if you have a realist gnoseology, truth is understood as the conformity of mind with reality. Okay? So when my mind agrees, is conformed to what is actually out there in the world. So if we understand that the world actually exists and it can be known, well then truth occurs when I know it as it is. Yes?
How would an idealist define truth?
An idealist might define truth as coherence, meaning the agreement of ideas among themselves or propositions among themselves, because they don't believe that there's actually something outside the mind, and so all you have are the ideas agreeing with themselves. All right, so coherence, that's called coherence theory. This is conformity. All right, truth as conformity. So I wanted to get to all this to get to a fundamental something that keeps coming up: fact versus opinion. All right, fact versus opinion. Well, fact is a vague term deriving from the Latin factum, which means something that's been done or made. Okay? So something that's been done or made. But they're not contiguous categories. What does that mean? Not everything fits into that neat schema of either fact or opinion. Okay. Not everything can be classified as either a fact or opinion. So, example, you can have an opinion about a fact. You might think that that fact, so-called fact, is not really a fact, but something else. I might have the opinion that the fact of the moon not being made out of cheese is wrong. Well, in that case, my opinion about that fact is wrong, because the moon, in fact, is not made out of cheese, let's say. But, so, in other words, I can have a wrong opinion. I can also have a right opinion. I have the opinion that that is truly a fact. Okay, so they're not contiguous realities, meaning it's not completely mutually exclusive. They overlap in different ways. And there's different words you can use to describe what's going on. For example, belief. You can have different beliefs about facts as well as different beliefs about opinions. I might believe that your opinion about a fact is wrong. Okay, that might be an opinion about an opinion, right? Now, I might believe something, but it could be based on evidence and argumentation, right? I believe that it is a fact that the moon is not made out of cheese for various reasons, okay? Or I might have a belief that's completely random, right? Usually when we hear belief, we think the same thing is it's the same as opinion, as if they're just random. Like, I just make up stuff as I go along. And that might be the case. A lot of people do base their beliefs on random opinion. But it might also be the case that you base your beliefs on facts. Not just facts, but evidence and argumentation. See, facts have to do with what's out in the world, but we have to understand what's in the world through evidence and argumentation. So there's the subject, me, and the object out there. Now, to give an example of a political example, if anyone knows, I can't remember her name, blonde lady who helped Trump win. Kellyanne Conway. Yeah, thank you. She said, famously in an interview, alternative facts. We have alternative facts or something like that. And NPR and people on the other side make fun of that over and over again. Which, fine, yeah, that's not phrasing it very well. Now, what I think she meant to say, could be wrong, was their alternative understanding of what the facts are. Right? So you can dispute, is that really a fact or is it not? Now, we have an alternative view of whether or not those are facts. Right? Now, in politics, it gets very murky. Well, what exactly are you saying is a fact, and whether or not that's a fact? So I just want to point that out. They're not completely mutually exclusive. Any questions on that before I move on to anthropological foundations? Real quick. All right. So, you guys, when I was gone, were supposed to take this, well, it wasn't a quiz, do this assignment of all the questions based on the lectures that I gave previously on this material. I have a feeling I'm not going to be very happy when I look at some of your answers. So I'm going to go really quickly through the beginning of this, and then later we'll pick up the rest, okay? So, anthropological foundations, what is that talking about? Well, philosophical anthropology is striving to understand what is the nature of the human being. So we had ontology or metaphysics, which is what's being, where we talked about the transcendentals and the causes of being, including God, etc., etc. Now we have what's the human being. So now we're getting closer to ethics. The next presentation will be starting with the first truths of ethics. Okay. Now this is getting there. Now we're talking about what is the human being? Well, we have these different faculties or powers. Intellect, the ability to think abstractly. Will, okay, the capacity to choose. Okay, and then we have all these other things that we could talk about. We won't talk about these things. All right, emotion, passion. We got the internal senses, imagination, memory, common sense, estimative power, and other senses, the external senses we all know. Okay. Now, what is a human being is one question, and then you can get a little more personal. Well, who is the human being? Okay, meaning looking at the human being from the capacity of being able to relate to other beings, including the transcendent. Okay, so religious being, the man is a religious being, doesn't mean that man goes to church all the time, but is capable of relating to God. It's the only animal that you see having burial services and other religious rites and so on and so forth. So that's one thing that distinguishes the human being from other animals, is that is capable of religion. Religion meaning just trying to worship God in some way or fashion. All right, so a discipline of philosophical anthropology would be the phenomenology and philosophy of religion. Phenomenology is phenomenon, which is just something that happens, an event or a fact, a given, okay? And so phenomenology looks at all these things and tries to describe the human being. Describe religion. Okay, what is common to all the religions? What things are common to all the religions? What distinguishes religion from other human activities? Religious activities from other human activities, okay? so on and so forth. So that's what phenomenology of religion does, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then building on that, philosophy of religion goes a little bit deeper, going beyond description to looking for causes. What are the causes of religion? In other words, what is religion really in its essence? Okay, getting beyond what's common to all the religions. All right, so next, this will be the last one. We'll say that there are different ways of defining the human being throughout the history of philosophy. One, the most common, is man as a rational animal. Okay? Meaning, animal is anything that moves around, senses, interacts with its environment, has not only vegetative qualities like the vegetables, plants, the nutritive qualities of vegetative life, but also ability to move itself around and sense things and so on and so forth. Okay, and many of them have the internal senses as well. But man also has the capacity, for example, to have classes over abstract topics. Okay. So far, I haven't seen any evidence that monkeys and dolphins engage in theology, but who knows? I could be wrong. So we define human being as not only rational animal. Another way would be an embodied spirit or an ensouled body, and we'll talk about what does that mean a little bit in just a second. Or a religious animal. So the only animal that's capable of religion. So two different reductionisms that we want to avoid are, in Western thought, is common, a reductionism that is the opposite of what's common in Eastern thought. Now, in Western, we tend to reduce everything to the material. The material causes of things. So what chemistry looks at, what biology looks at. Okay, reducing the human being just to the material is not looking at the whole reality of the human being. Okay, and we'll talk about how that's the case in a little bit. Now, another reductionism, reducing the whole to just part of it, would be the Eastern mysticism, which says we're really not bodies. The material is just a delusion. It's all illusionary. So we're just really spirits occupying some space. Maybe not even that. But we're essentially spiritual beings, okay? And the rest is just illusion. All right, so that's reducing the human being to his spiritual capacities of intellect and will. Now, so what do I mean by spiritual capacity? And what do I mean by soul? Well, soul comes from the German Seele, but from the Greek psyche and Latin anima, it's more clear what the word actually means. It has to do with moving around. Okay, so in ancient philosophy, they developed the word to describe things that have life, in other words. So anything with life, in philosophical terminology, has a soul. Okay, so plants have souls, animals have souls, including us. Okay, so the soul is just the form animating the matter, or the principle of life, by which that thing is able to move around, sense things, interact with its environment. Not necessarily move itself, like vegetative can't move, but they do move through the soil, for example. So there's vegetative soul would be different, though, from an animal soul. Okay? Or sentient soul, it's called. The capacity to sense things and respond. So the soul, then, is not necessarily immaterial. It might be a material soul. In other words, it's a soul that has no spiritual capacities. It's life, and that's why it's called soul. It's an organism of some sort. Okay? And that's what the word really means. Now, when we're talking about the human soul, what distinguishes the human soul from other souls is its spiritual faculties. Now, what do I mean by spiritual? I don't mean ephemeral or not really real. I mean immaterial, beyond matter. Okay, so the intellect and will, we'll see a little later, are properly immaterial faculties, which doesn't mean that they hover above matter and they don't interact with matter at all, but just that they can't be reduced completely to matter. Okay, so if you look, we won't go over this now, but just to show you, actually we probably won't go over this at all, but you can look at it if you want. St. Thomas's arguments, philosophical arguments for the natural immortality of the rational soul. So, in a nutshell, he says, okay, we start out describing activities. We have certain activities that manifest powers. We engage in these activities, namely understanding universals, for example, and those manifest, therefore, the power or the faculty to understand universals, and those powers go beyond matter. In other words, they can't be reduced to material causes. And so because the human being has intellect and will, these powers that can't be reduced to matter, therefore at death, at the decomposition of the body, when the body decomposes, the body is deprived of life, the intellect and will survive. The human soul survives death because it's not subject to the decomposition that happens to matter. Okay? Intellect and will are immaterial, and so because they're immaterial, which is another word for spiritual, that's what spiritual means here, something that is not subject to decomposition is therefore immortal, meaning is not subject to death. All right. So the rational. So these are various arguments. You can go that one, and then there's more here for the natural immortality of the rational soul, which we won't get into. But thank you very much for your attention.